Hello, today I'm going to talk about my top 20 Detroit garage rock songs. I've been putting this off for a long time. If you've watched my channel, you probably realized I'm from Detroit. That's in my title of my channel. Maybe because I am from Detroit, it's a little bit too close to home and I just wanted to do it justice, so I've been dreading this a little bit. The other night, I watched the Jim Jarmusch documentary on Iggy and the Stooges called Gimme Danger, and then I realized now's the time, so I put this together. A little disclaimer first, there are many rock bands from Detroit from many different eras. This is not a comprehensive list. I could only pick 20 songs. I tried to pick my favorites weighted against historical importance. One other thing I actually want to point out is that I did live in downtown Detroit around the time many of these bands were playing around town. Bands like the White Stripes, Electric Six, Bondies, when they were all coming up. Unfortunately, there are many other bands from that time that only put out 7 inches or didn't last very long. Some of them were amazing and they're not going to be on this list. But unfortunately, I think everyone focuses on the White Stripes. No offense to them. I like them as well. They were kind of like the Nirvana of Seattle. They were kind of that for Detroit, and they were the tip of that pyramid. There were so many other bands underneath, but let's get into it. At number 20, we have the Gories. There But the Grace of God Go I is the song from the album Outta Here from 1992. I remember in my early 20s, this band was kind of mythical. People in the Detroit rock scene would talk of them with reverence. I never saw them live, but I did see both of their later projects, the Dirtbombs, which had Mick Collins, and the Demolition, which had Dan Croha. They will both be later on this list. But I'll be honest with you, I actually liked their later bands better. I think the reason that people gave this so much reverence is because it was at a time where there wasn't a lot like this happening in Detroit. It's kind of a low period in the late 80s, early 90s, but there would be a renaissance, an explosion of garage rock that would happen in the early 2000s. And you could have said the first movement would have been Mitch, Ryder, Detroit Wheels, that era, and then on into the Stooges. At number 19, we have Destroy All Monsters. The song is You're Gonna Die from the album Bored, recorded in 1978 and released in 1991. This is more of an art rock noise band, but it does lean into garage. Co-founders Mike Kelly and Jim Shaw were both artists, and Detroit art scene staple Niagara joined later. Ron Ashton, guitarist from the Stooges, was a late period member. I would say this sums up Detroit attitude. Rocking, but also artistic, raw power, this kind of punk swagger. At number 18, we have Bob Seger, Heavy Music Part 1, from the Heavy Music, The Complete Cameo Recordings, 1966 to 1967, and it was released in 2018. This was originally released in 1967 as a single when Bob Seger was in a band called The Last Herd, and I don't think a lot of people realize that at the beginning he was definitely garage rock. I mean, he retained that Detroit style once he went into the mainstream, but the early recordings definitely show it. I love Bob Seger. Against the Wind is one of my favorite songs of all time, but this early view of him I think is very telling. At number 17, we have the Demolition Doll Rods. The song is Get It On, and it's from the album On from 2004. I mentioned them earlier. They're probably one of the best live bands I've ever seen, especially they never got really that famous. This is a mix of raunchy glam rock and garage rock. Think the New York Dolls meets the Cramps meets the Stooges. Dan Croha went by Danny Dahlrod, and he did the guitar and vocals. Margaret Dahlrod also did guitar and lead vocals and the songwriting. And Christine Dahlrod was on drums originally. That was the lineup I saw. Dan would be in this kind of pseudo drag, so it appeared like it was 3 women on stage, and they'd wear either these skimpy outfits or saran wrap sometimes. Definitely a spectacle, and I liked the music too, but I think going to the show was the real experience. Experience. At number 16, we have the Paybacks. The song is Love Letter, and it's from Love Not Reason, 2006. So like I said, there were a lot of bands in the revival, and this is no slight against the Paybacks, but they were kind of the lower tier. There were definitely bands that were more famous than them, and I did like them. I saw them a few times. I think they were kind of nondescript compared to the others though, and they were a little bit of a super group, but they contained members of the Hentchmen, Rocket 455, and 10 High. I saw Rocket 455 several times. At number 15, we have Co and the Knockouts, You're on My Mind, from Co and the Knockouts, 2002. Around this time, I was working at a restaurant downtown called Cass Cafe in the Cass Corridor. There were several people that I worked with that were in some of these bands. I knew the drummer of this band, Jeff. He was a very nice guy, but I knew people in a band called the Slumber Party who got a little bit big, Detroit City Council. There were many people that would come through this restaurant, not just in the bands that I knew, but people that they knew. So I would run into a lot of these people. At the time, I didn't really understand the weight of that. For me, it was just living in that neighborhood. It wasn't until several years later that I realized that some of these people were actually kind of famous. You know, people like Rodriguez and John Sinclair would come in there. I didn't really get it until after. At number 14, we have the White Stripes. When I Hear My Name, from the White Stripes, 1999. I don't have much to say about them. Everybody knows the White Stripes. Everyone has an opinion. I could have put many songs on here. I ended up putting 2. This is one of them. I think this is one of their more garage rock tracks. You know, they blew up and I think they deserve it, but I also think there were a lot of other equally great bands that didn't quite get the notoriety that they got. At number 13, we have the Hentchmen. The song is April from the album 3 Times Infinity, 2002. I really love this song. It's quite good. It just reminds me a lot of that time and the music scene around the Cass Corridor. It was a really thriving time in Detroit, contrary to what, you know, the view of Detroit might have been. You know, all these bands played all the time. It wasn't strange to see, you know, 2 or 3 of these bands playing together. Places like the Gold Dollar, the Magic Stick, PJ's Lager House, Zoots. I think they were quite accessible. Like it was easy to kind of just go see a show for $5, you know? At number 12, we have the Bondies. Come On, Pawn Shop Heart, 2004. This was quite a big hit and it's more polished than some of the others on here. I think this is a bridge between underground Detroit garage rock and early 2000s indie rock. It was produced by Jack White. Speaking of him, in 2003, there was a highly publicized altercation between Jason and Jack. I think it was at the Magic Stick. I'm not certain about that. Could have been at the Garden Bowl or somewhere. I just remember it being a huge thing around town. Everyone was talking about it. But I think this album is excellent. The entire album is a classic. At number 11, we have the Dirtbombs, Chains of Love, from Ultra Glide in Black, 2001. My next 2 entries are probably my favorite albums from that revival era. The Dirtbombs album is super good. I actually used to have it on LP before I moved to Korea. If you like soul music and you like garage rock, I definitely think you should check this out if you've never heard it. It's super raw, but also quite rocking out. They were also good live. At number 10, we have the Detroit Cobras, Shout Bamalama, Life, Love, and Leaving, from 2001. This is my favorite song on the album, but the entire album is gold. I love her voice. It's strong yet soulful at the same time. I also think the album cover is quite iconic and it works really well with the music. You know, some of these bands initially just formed to do covers. Over time, they kind of expanded their repertoire out. This has a lot of raw energy to it, and it definitely has Detroit grit. At number 9, we have Question Mark and the Mysterians, 96 Tears, from 96 Tears, 1966. This is a very famous song. A lot of people don't know it comes from Detroit. It's so awesome. The thing to note about it is that there's this whole subgenre of garage rock that leans into like Dick Dale or, you know, surf. The Amino Acids were a band like this in Detroit. They were quite popular at that time. I didn't put them on here because I think they lean a little bit more into punk. They definitely go into that kind of science fiction, horror surf stuff. But what's interesting about this song is it's almost a ballad, but a strange ballad. And I love the organ. The organ is amazing. And this is one of the early examples of Detroit garage rock. At number 8, we have Electric Six, Danger High Voltage from the album Fire, 2003. I suppose it's a toss-up between this and Gay Bar, although I think Gay Bar leans a little bit more disco. And I also think that this is the superior song, and it's quite fun. They are a combo of disco and garage rock. You wouldn't think those two things would work together, but it absolutely does. And this is so Detroit. I mean, just the fact that in the lyrics they're talking about all the fires and stuff, it's just really awesome. This is a great song to dance to. And there were some other bands like this at that time that leaned more into funk as well. The Detroit City Council was one of them. Unfortunately, they didn't last very long, so if you do some digging, you might be able to find something on them. At number 7, we have Mitch, Ryder and the Detroit Wheels. Devil with a Blue Dress On and Good Golly Miss Molly. This is from Sockin' It To You, the complete Dino Voice, New Voice recordings from 1966, released in 2020. This is another influential early garage rock song. And I would think if you're gonna stem garage rock back, Mitch Ryder is the root. I did struggle a little bit here because I also wanted to put Sock It To Me Baby, which is another really great Mitch Ryder song. If I did that though, I would have had to boot someone else, and I kind of just felt like I had to put everybody else on here. I think this is very energetic, very rockin'. Whenever you see someone cover this song, it always gets people moving, and I think the energy is very, very Detroit. At number 6, we have Suzi Quatro, 48 Crash, from Suzi Quatro, 1973. So Suzi leans more into glam rock in some ways. I will do a full video on her at some point. She is so influential to female rockers. You would have no Joan Jett without Suzi Quatro, no Runaways. I think this is one of her best tracks. It's really, really good. I also think she doesn't get enough credit. People are always saying Joan Jett, Debbie Harry, Patti Smith, Chrissy Hine. Suzi Quatro was first. At number 5, we have the MC5, Kick Out the Jams. Kick Out the Jams Live, 1969. I think this exemplifies the Detroit energy. They were called the Motor City Five. It draws on that energy from the Detroit riots in 1967. I do like them, although I think the Stooges were a bit better. Unfortunately, they're most known for this song, and a lot of their other songs I like, but they don't quite reach the heights of this song. This does encapsulate that fiery late 60s revolutionary energy. This is definitely about the counterculture, and maybe they invented punk rock. Some people would say the Stooges, but the MC5 were first. Wayne Kramer, so famous around Detroit. Fred Sonic Smith is another legend. He was the husband of Patti Smith. There's something quite free jazz about this. There's also Chuck Berry thrown in there, maybe even a little bit of the band Them, but it's awesome stuff. At number 4, we have the Stooges. The song is 1969 from the album The Stooges, 1969. So I tried, but I couldn't pick just one Stooges song. It was impossible, especially if I'm considering the historical aspect of all this. So the next 3 out of 4 are the Stooges, unfortunately. There is method to my madness though. I love the beat of this song. I think the first album was definitely a group effort. It was produced by John Cale of the Velvet Underground. Here's the lineup of this incarnation, but I think this emphasizes heavy groove and attitude over technical polish. And we all know that Iggy was an animal. I saw him once at the State Theater in Detroit. I believe it was like 1996 or 97. I don't remember what year. It was insane. It was definitely insane. At that time, he would have been like nearly 50 years old, and he was climbing up the balconies and stuff. I mean, he was doing some really dangerous stuff, and I can't imagine that because I'm about the age that he was when he did that, so I don't know. At number 3, we have the White Stripes. The song is Black Math off of Elephant from 2003. I think this is one of the best White Stripes songs. That may be sacrilege to some, but it's super garage rock and it's super tough. It really, really rocks out. I mean, it's really amazing how much sound comes from only 2 people. This one is kind of part Mark Bolan, part Howlin' Wolf, part Led Zeppelin. I think it's so good. It's riff driven, aggressive, wild, urgent, gritty, emotionally charged. I just think it's a masterpiece. At number 2, we have Iggy and the Stooges, Search and Destroy from Raw Power, 1973. By this time, Iggy was legendary, hence the name change. I just love how out of control it sounds. The whole album, actually. It just sounds like it's gonna fall apart at any second. I just think it sums up the Detroit ethos. It's snarling, urgent, slightly unhinged. They are giving 120%. It sounds kind of industrial. It's explosive. I would imagine this is about as close as it gets to what they would have sounded like live. It's about rebellion and chaos and youth fury. This has been covered many times by many people. But at number 1, we have the Stooges, I Want to Be Your Dog, from the Stooges, 1969. So I chose 3 songs by them because you can't really understate their importance. It was a struggle to only choose 3, to be honest. I love Gimme Danger, No Fun, Real Cool Time. There are many, many good Stooges songs, but I think the opening guitar squeal just says it all. It just says, okay, here we are, we're doing it. But then when the riff starts and then the sleigh bells come in, it just rocks so hard. It's hypnotic, raw, instantly recognizable. Iggy's vocals are snarling, but at the same time vulnerable and quite urgent. It's really the epitome of garage rock, I'd say. Anyway, if you haven't seen the documentary, you should. It's very good. I don't think any of the revival bands that I mentioned would have existed without the Stooges, but that's all I got for this. If you think I left something off, you can put that below. Or if you have a favorite Detroit garage rock band, you can also put that below. But that's all I got. Take care. Have a good day.